What is the sign you have in the background?
Yeah, that's from a project that I did for my advanced organizational behavior course. And it was a paper I wrote about diversity. I basically said that diversity, how it is today, is really just assimilation. Um, because if they don't allow indigenous people or other cultures to practice their ways of knowing and understanding and allow that to change the framework of an institution, then they're really just force assimilating us into their dominant culture. Especially with like indigenous epistemology being that we have relationships with the land and our ancestors. And so if we're not allowed to fully practice that, and if that's not coveted and respected in an institution, then they're kind of just forcing us to into their ways of being.
I agree. I mean, stripping any indigenous knowledge from its context leaves it kind of useless in a sense. Like you can't take away indigenous knowledge from like our understanding of relationship and culture and expect it to work exactly the way they want it to in their systems. But anyway, maybe we should save this for the conversation.
Well, it's a great way to start the video. Thank you everyone for joining us today in this awesome interview with myself and Brook Thompson. Brook has a civil engineering degree from Portland State. She has a master's in environmental engineering from Stanford University. She's currently pursuing her PhD at UC Santa Cruz, focusing on salmon restoration, water policy, and indigenous knowledge systems. Her work has been featured in ABC 10, UC Davis News, The Story Exchange, as well as having numerous academic publications. She's a Ford Foundation Fellow, Indian Collective Changemaker, and Yurok Tribe Restoration Engineer. So all around just doing such incredible work, but I'll allow you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. Nick now, Brook Thompson. Watek me work me cook. Eureka ak pudaglawe ese pichaglawe ne pichuas Iwak Archie Thompson. So, hey, my name is Brook Thompson. I'm from the Yurok and Karuk tribes. My family is from the Watek village on the Klamath River, and I'm currently in Eureka, but I'm also the granddaughter of Archie Thompson, rest in peace. And we were just mentioning previously how I also like to add, in addition to my academic and kind of job background, that I also do artwork. And art and artistry is, for me, a part of the academic side, but often not as recognized as often. And I just think art and sciences are so, and just indigenous culture too, is just so well intertwined to each other that I just like to give that shout out to myself as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. Do you sell your beadwork, or you just do it, you make it for family and gift it?
I mainly make it for family or gift it, or sometimes I have artwork and then there'll be like someone I come across and it just feels like that's the right person to give it to. I kind of joke that I feel like beadwork especially takes so much time that it seems that the price I would need to sell it for what it's worth seems like anyone who I'd want it to have it wouldn't be able to afford it. So much of myself goes into it. Like I not only the effort and the time and the money for the beads, but also I don't do beadwork when I'm upset. I only think like positive thoughts and put good energy into all my work. And so I want to make sure that's something you can't put a price on. So I want it to go to someone that I really feel like will appreciate it the way it needs to.
I can definitely understand and respect that, because the beads, the materials relatively aren't the expensive part of it, but it takes hours and hours and hours, days on end, of you just putting thought, intention, creativity, prayer. And how do you put a price on prayer and intention? And the truth is you can't, because the second you start putting a number to it, it loses its meaning.
Yeah, I I agree. But I mean, I do the alternative too, where I have like my card game. I do Go Fish, where I drew all the pictures for Go Fish of local sea creatures and river creatures, and that's something that like I can do art for, that's like easily more mass produced than like say beadwork is, because each beadwork is like a unique piece I'm not going to recreate. But something like doing scientific illustrations or drawing of animals, that's something easier that I can give out cheaper and help to support myself, and honestly use art and selling these things as a way to support my academics.
That's amazing. You know, I've seen a Yurok tribal member. She does a raffle. Like she'll do a drawing. So you send her like $20, and then she puts, and then it's just a bunch of names. It'll be, and it ends up being like 100 names, and then whoever gets chosen gets that, you know, whatever she had made that time. So
I kind of like that method too. Like leave it up to luck. Like maybe the person who deserves to have it will just have that luck on their side. I mean, I feel like a lot of art culture has that kind of luck and gambling component to it. I feel like that's almost traditional.
Yeah, that's funny. So could you explain to me your PhD and that you're working on? And
I mean, I hope so. I mean, that's the thing about PhDs is like you're always continuously trying to figure out your PhD work because it changes so much in the 5+ years it takes to get one. And so my PhD work at its most basic, it requires a social science chapter, a natural science chapter, and a coastal science and policy chapter. And each chapter is a different science experiment or a different study, and they all relate on one big topic for the PhD thesis as a whole, or the dissertation you defend. And so this is for environmental studies. So my social science component, my focus is on traditional ecological knowledge and social environmental justice. My specialty in the natural science component is Chinook salmon life pathways, history, and just all around basics about Chinook salmon and their environment. And then my coastal science and policy section is about water policy in California, restoration theory, especially in the state of California, and co-management / co-creation of knowledge, in addition to like general water policy in the state. So my experiments are still kind of in the work for each of those sections and how I'm going to contribute to those fields of knowledge, but those are generally like my specialties, which kind of culminates to, at its most basic, me wanting to help out salmon and water in the state of California. However, I can contribute to that in my small way through this research and try to demystify, hopefully, better ways that tribes can work with the state, or rather that the state can work with tribes, so that everyone in California can have a healthier environment. And when I say everyone, I mean not just our two-legged relatives. I mean like the plants, the animals, salmon, etc. too, because it really takes all of us to be healthy for any one of us to be healthy.
yeah, that's a good point. Actually, you wrote it. There's a quote from you from an article published by Proven Sustainable, and we had just had an interview with them. And one of the quotes you said, the most unselfish thing that we can do is heal ourselves. So I think that is a very nice quote that fits in right here. Because environmental restoration, to me, is part of that healing journey for ourselves as well. Just being so connected to our lands and being able to heal that is healing us. You know, I can actually feel a physical difference with the healing of the Klamath River. I feel like I can feel it.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't surprise me. I think even like the small things, because I feel like there's a bias where it's easier to tell when things are going wrong and don't feel good versus like taking time to recognize when things do feel good. So, for example, the fact that we have such a stark decrease in that cyanobacteria that was part of these harmful blue-green algae blooms that had these toxins in it, and that we had these every single year with the dams, and that this is like one of the first years we haven't had warnings for harmful levels in the river. And knowing people who have been hospitalized for contact with that toxic blue-green algae, and now that's not a threat, and recognizing that, not only doing restoration work, feeling that bit of better, but also knowing less people are getting sick in general has been really exciting, even if it's not impacting me as much, which it is because I do spend a lot of time on the river. But it's just nice to know that there's like that one less harm to us physically, plus additional, I mean, for me, benefit spiritually of seeing that healing.
So, what is your definition of traditional ecological knowledge?
Man, actually, I just got, that's one of the things I'm turning in for my PhD is this paper. So I have 10,000 words that about my definition. The summary of it, which might not make sense without all the context of what I wrote previously, but what one of my arguments is for traditional ecological knowledge is because traditional ecological knowledge is so regionally specific and so localized that should be honored by each community coming up with their own definition. And so I feel like even generalizing the term traditional ecological knowledge for one universal definition is almost taking that power away from the localization. So I think everyone should come up with their own, or at least every like indigenous community should come up with their own definition of what traditional ecological knowledge means to them and what that looks like. And knowing that English language doesn't hold all the right words necessarily to describe what traditional ecological knowledge should be, since words like land, nature, water, and natural resources don't have the same meaning for a lot of people in English that we do when we're describing those same terms in our native languages, because for many of us, water is relation. We have rocks in our tribe that have spiritual power and that have a place in our society that are relations. And to other people, when they hear a conversation around traditional ecological knowledge and hear the word like, oh, talking about rocks, they're seeing resources, they're seeing capital, they're seeing an investment, they're seeing like the exact dollar translation. And yeah, long story short, for me, it's a combination of indigenous knowledge over multiple generations since time immemorial that is in combination with localized understanding, in addition to spiritual connection of relationship and nature and culture and religion that can't be separated from one another, because nature is a part of our culture and religion inherently. And so that is my long-winded definition.
Yeah, so, okay, I definitely hear you about the English language not having the right mechanisms or structure to really translate what traditional ecological knowledge is to indigenous people, especially being that it is a master language. Everything has ownership built into it. Even when you're talking about your relative, like my mom, like me claiming her, like that's mine, and so there's that kind of ownership built into it, which is a reinforcement of hierarchical structures that are built, and that's just not the way that we view the world. And I also have a deep understanding about it being highly localized and place-based and connected to the indigenous people, because that is where the indigenous people came out of the earth. That's our ceremonies and our language are connected highly and deeply to that specific place and the relationship to it. And so just inherently the knowledge is deeper, but also the interpersonal connection is a lot deeper. And so it is very difficult to get to a universal definition of traditional ecological knowledge, but inherently that's kind of the issue I feel like that we're running into when we're working with Western structures that are overseeing our restoration. The TEK is not accepted as an actual model. It is heard and respected, and oftentimes mostly just used as a like a media tool. Like, oh, we're using traditional ecological knowledge, but it's not actually the model that's being used, and it's not implemented on a measurable, impactful way. And so I think we really need to get to a place where we identify what traditional ecological is universally and come up with some type of, I hate to say it, but we have to create some type of structure for it to be able to get this on an implementable level.
I'm laughing because I hear the cat in the background.
Oh, yeah. I know. He just wants to be all up in the business right now.
He has the input on it too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Get out
I
of here.
think that is the basic struggle, is that there's this great book called Pollution is Colonialism. And in that book, it talks about how Western structures and academia specifically really strives for universalism. And so like even creating our equations, like equations I use as an engineer, such as the Streeter-Phelps equation, which is how you look at dissolved oxygen in a river, that's applied universally. Like that can be applicable anywhere if we're looking at dissolved oxygen, which dissolved oxygen is important because that's what aquatic life breathes. Just like how we breathe oxygen in the air, they get it from the water. And yet this book argues that that universalistic take, that everything must be applied to this, really takes away the nuance from individual systems where we may be losing out on potential for like better healing or better equations and better restoration work, because we are just saying like this is good enough and people are taking it as truth, not recognizing the complexity in each location. And also the fact that anytime we give a baseline of a standard for a government or a group to work at as being like, hey, here's the minimum we need for this organism to survive, that will then become the standard instead of the minimum, because we will just be given the basics of the not what's needed to thrive, but what's needed to just not die completely. And I think that scarcity mindset is not good for long-term ecological like growth. And that, I would argue, I guess this is like my more not like extremist, but my like higher, I guess, wish, because I know there's that difference in reality about how things ought to be and how I wish things were ideally, and then how we need to take incremental steps to get there, because we can't make these changes overnight, and there are still frameworks are already in place that are useful, but that Western sciences and management should try a little bit harder to understand and come to us where we're needed and where we're at, versus us always trying to conform our knowledge into their existing frameworks and systems, because it's their systems that have gotten us into these environmentally like negative situations that we're currently in. We have been the ones who had the time tested and wise knowledge that has been used over thousands of years since time immemorial, where we've successfully not only kept the environment healthy but in abundance, not by mistake but through management and practice. And yet it feels oftentimes that Indigenous involvement is a checkbox instead of the standard, instead of actually being appreciated for what it is. And so, yeah, my arguments so far, and my opinions are always changing in academia as I read more, as I see more case studies, but that we can use things such as there's tribes in Washington that use a first foods framework for restoration work, where there's tribes in Washington that serve food in certain orders based on like water, game meat, berries or harvested food, etc. And they use that as a framework for their restoration techniques, and have adapted how they do restoration work to this traditional framework of how they serve food and how they see the environment. And that's been very successful for them. And I think frameworks like that, like not saying that framework would necessarily work in a tribe in Southern California. I think Southern California tribes, or our tribe, has their own ways of knowing that, is going to be applicable to our specific regions and forests, because what might work in Arizona in a desert climate won't necessarily work as a framework for traditional ecological knowledge in Northern California in our rainforests.
Yeah, and the tough part is we're not just combating the scientific community that's very protective, because their whole careers are based on reinforcing the current methods. But we're also combating the business aspect of it. And because restoration is still a for-profit industry, governments do get involved, but then they subcontract to organizations that are for-profit that oversee it, because it's all based on bidding for the contract. And so that means that they have this much money to not only get the project done, but that's also included in their shareholder profit margin as well. and there's a equation. It's called revenue recognized, right? So if you have a contract price and your project is going to go on for 5 or 10 years, you're now going to use an equation called revenue recognized to figure out how much revenue you're making on the project each year with that one contract price. And so as you're getting down and you're like 50% of the project and you've already recognized, 60, 70% of the revenue, and you're still trying to make a profit for your shareholders, a lot of things are going to start getting cut out of the restoration. They don't have money for hand seeding an entire project, especially when you're talking about, large, miles and miles of riverbed. They don't have time to do that. So that's going to get cut. They're going to start doing mass seeding, dropping seeds from helicopters, that kind of thing, where they're going to try to streamline it as best as they can and then find a standard process somewhere else that has worked on a minimal level. And that's what they're there to do, is just get the job done. And they're not there to really see the restoration to full healing. And so that's kind of where I want to figure out a way to communicate where TEK is not only the most efficient way, it's the most cost-effective way to heal and really.
I feel like you bring up a lot of really good points of the bigger structural issues with that implementation of TEK, because you're 100% right. There's the reality of cost, there's the reality of time, there's the reality of meeting budgets, there's the reality of showing progress, and the systems that are in place for that aren't really conducive to how I'd ideally like to see TEK involved. And there is a lot of benefit from it, but I guess I try to balance that with, I want to make sure it's also not potentially hurting us to be involved in that as well, because it's if you talk to anyone who's Indigenous and over 50, right, there's a big distrust of companies and governments because of past harm. And I feel also hesitant for myself, even encouraging TEK use in certain circumstances, because I want to ensure that harm isn't perpetuated by someone who doesn't really understand the depth of TEK, or kind of like how we're talking about beadwork, someone collecting seeds for a revegetation process, not understanding that it's not just collecting seeds, it's also that reconnection to nature and that consideration that Indigenous peoples have for each of these plants. And, even getting to sing to these plants and reconnect with understanding these, beings that we haven't had the privilege to be connected with for a long time because of legislation that removed us from environments. But at the same time, for me, I think the thinking of how we have to reproduce results isn't conducive to a lot of the actual benefits from TEK. I mean, when I think about, going to the funding side, there's also the policy side. So restoration is interesting, right? Because it's not something that you really make a ton of profit off of. You're bidding for projects that are funded by nonprofits or governments technically, it's I'll go on a tangent about the profit side. And I know you're interested in economics, so maybe we can go on with that, because it does actually add a lot of that profit back into communities and does save a lot. If you're cleaning up areas that were causing harm, such as doing restoration on the Klamath River, where you're reducing those blue-green algae toxic levels we were talking about, if you have less people getting sick from that, then that's less impact on the healthcare system and people paying those fees and services. So you're reducing those costs there, but that's not a direct cost that you can easily list out when you're looking at project benefits. And it's not a direct cost that company is making, but it's a societal cost that everyone was paying into that now they don't have to, but isn't easily recognizable because it's hidden under a few levels of benefit. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to goals, a lot of times, from what I've seen, having previously been an intern for the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs in DC, having worked for the City of Portland Bureau of Environmental Services as an intern as well, and on the state level through the California Water Resource Control Board on the Office of Information and Management, a lot of projects have these 2 to 6 year time windows. And that's because elections happen in those same timeframes. And a lot of these projects get funded by public agencies or by at least partial taxpayer money. And if that happens, a lot of politicians who want to get reelected need to show that there is a substantial amount of change that they can list within their next reelection cycle, so they can use that as a benefit to get reelected, because they can be like, hey, I did this thing. This is the progress that your taxpayer money went to. Reelect me so we can keep doing this. But the environment and restoration and how the ecosystem responds isn't necessarily on the same timeline as a campaign, which is arbitrary compared to like the actual science that goes on in ecosystem restoration. And so there's that mismatch there where, like, I understand why we have to have reports and show progress, and it's also important for accountability. But also the amount of, say, like, for example, you could have non-natives collect seeds, get them from a separate location. You get the same type of plants from, I don't know, like Argentina. It's just like a really random place. But say you get them from Argentina, they're cheaper, and then you spread them by helicopter over the landscape. And you see these great blooms that happen for a few years, and it was way cheaper. Great. But the issue with that is if we're not collecting plants from local areas, like was done through hand picking all these seeds and then growing them, those plants have very specific genetics that are adapted to that area. And it's initially more time consuming and expensive to do that. But because they have those genetics that have evolved over hundreds of years, even though it's the same species of plant, their genetics are different enough where they're adapted for that local environment. They're going to be more successful and take better 100 years from now than those plants that were the same species but taken from a different location. But that's never going to be seen as a priority in any expense report, because you're not going to see that real benefit of how those plants were higher quality from that local area for decades later.
Right, and it also, it doesn't matter to meet your requirements to close the contract. Yeah, that's you hit a lot of great points there. It's like in the long run, if you do things traditional ecological knowledge, if you do it that model, it's on the ground with your hands a lot more. It takes a lot, probably years longer than other processes would. But once you're done with the project and you walk away after a couple years, you'll never be able to tell that humans were there. And it won't take long-term management. The land will just take care of itself at that point. But then with the way that things are done now, it's over-engineered, and it's heavily standardized processes that are going to maybe produce quick results, but in the long run are going to need long-term management. So...
yeah, well, I mean, I would argue that it should require long-term management. I mean, that's what we did as tribes, right? We are the long-term management. Like us, when we collect basket materials, so one of the things I'm trying to push too is that gathering, hunting, and fishing are all part of restoration work in itself too. And they're a part of, you can't, for me, and my opinion actually changed after reading a lot of literature on this recently, is that you need to have indigenous hunting, fishing, and gathering to really value traditional ecological knowledge. So the fact that right when we gather basket materials, you have to burn to get some of those basket materials, such as like bear grass or these plants to reproduce, and we do that through those smaller cultural burns that then have that beneficial carbon layer to the forest, keep down all that buildup that would happen if we weren't doing cultural burns that then lead to larger wildfires, which are much more destructive. And we get the benefit from that, from getting these basket materials that we then use in our art and our daily lives. But doing that, right, it's that mutually beneficial relationship, but technically that is long-term management. But instead of getting paid by like a paycheck, right, we're getting paid in materials by the environment. And so I just like to push the idea that I think the goal shouldn't be to like not have the environment take care of itself necessarily, because in the US it hasn't been like that. We've always been taking care of the environment, and we've always been on the land. So it should be restoring that connection with Indigenous groups to be able to continue that management. Because I know a lot of people who'd be happy to collect acorns and
yeah,
if given the opportunity in exchange for, you know, taking care of the trees long term and cleaning up things when necessary, but in exchange, not getting paid in a paycheck, but getting paid in gathering.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we're always out there. Yeah, we're always out there anyways, getting root, getting whatever else, you know. Um, so what does indigenous engineering look like? Because you have your civil engineering degree. I could hardly picture you doing things from the Western approach. So what what's the indigenous version of engineering?
And I feel like part of that is I built a smokehouse this last weekend in my backyard with some friends and my dad's help. And I feel like his is indigenous engineering. He's a carpenter. Is him being like, okay, well, me trying to like figure out everything on a piece of paper and trying to like create exact numbers. And I'm like, okay, before we get out there, we'll cut this at this piece. And my dad and some other guys being like, we'll just like hold this up and like see where you want it about, and then like make the mark there and just cut everything through that length. Like that's indigenous engineering to me, to a certain extent. But also, to me, indigenous engineering is the fact that, right, we have redwood canoes that are, some of them are hundreds of years old, and to be able to take a redwood tree and knowing the size of that and make that into such a beautiful, symmetrical, practical canoe without any like previously without any modern power tools, that's indigenous engineering, because you have to know material properties. You also, I used to design concrete canoes, and understanding water dynamics and hydrology around the shape of the hull, the shape of the gunnel, the how the front of the boat, the stern and bow are made. Those all affect how the boat turns, how fast it goes, how much weight it can hold, and how it does against wind. And that has to be designed to every specific area you want to use the boat in or the canoe. And knowing our canoes are so well made for the river, it's not just the fact of like making something that floats that we can be in. It's like all those considerations of wind shear, of the hydrology of the river, all these things were found out over, hundreds, if not thousands of years of testing and understanding these engineering dynamics to such a degree to make it the canoes how we do now. That is like such a good example of engineering to me. And I think, again, obviously none of those people back before colonization had engineering degrees, but I would trust them over a lot of engineers I've met now to make a canoe if I had to put my life on it. And I think that's, yeah, that's underappreciated, how much science we put into every aspect of our culture and how we live our lives.
So, is your goal ultimately to use your degrees and bring that to the restoration world?
It's, my goal is to just try to be a good person.
That's a great goal.
Yeah.
I think my larger goal is, I think at its base, to try to just find solutions, like I said previously, that makes water more beneficial for everyone in California. And I just think certain groups have been overprivileged in their access to water and, frankly, abuse of it. And other groups have not been considered as much and have had to face repercussions for it. And so to bring some equity to that space and to try to promote this idea that, like, us as Indigenous peoples, we are not naive. We are not like this child that needs to be taken care of by the states or the feds, but more so that we have had this knowledge that is time tested and proven for thousands of years, that we have just been historically disadvantaged from using. And even when we do get chances to use it, the systems we have to force it into aren't necessarily the best for it to prosper. And so if, you have like projects where people try to incorporate TEK, but then it fails, it's not necessarily because the TEK failed or it was that idea. It's because the system it was forced into wasn't made for it to succeed in.
You bring up a good point about water policy. I actually have an interview with Christopher Hall. So anyone watching, I implore you to go check it out. Christopher Hall is a nonprofit called the Water League. is based in Oregon, and the organization's whole goal is to advocate for better water policy. And so in that interview, we talk about how 78% of the water, and this is for the state of California, although in Northern California specifically, if you isolate it from the rest of California, has very similar water policy to the state of Oregon. So it's a good case study to talk about, where 78% of the water rights and water users go to the agricultural community. So they're using 78% of the water, and they're only making about 2.5% of the GDP, which is important to note since everything ties back to money in Western systems. And most of their agricultural farms are cattle crops, so it's not even stuff that's making it to your table. It's all getting shipped out of state to go feed cattle, or it's going overseas, like in the form of alfalfa or lily bulbs, to China and Japan. So it's not anything that we're personally benefiting from. It's not benefiting the GDP that much, but it's a large amount of the water. And these water users are given a unfair say in how to manage water. You know, it doesn't really make sense that you would go to the people using all the water and ask them, hey, what do you think water policy should be? Because they're just going to say, drill, baby, drill, you know? And they're going to use, there are some watersheds, I'll say. There are some watersheds that have a sustainable water practice. But for the most part, people are just sucking the water until it's gone. And unfortunately, senior water users, it really comes down to who is the first white person to make it to that water source first. And then they have the senior water rights.
Yeah, I mean, right, that's the thing. A lot of our water policy is based on beneficial and riparian uses, which is, and as a state of California, and this is why I'm so fortunate that, I'm from a tribe here, is because California has so much power and it's so diverse that it really has the opportunity to be a leader, not only in the United States, but internationally, because of how much diversity we have in the state and how kind of complicated our systems are, for better or for worse. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the water rights were whoever was, quote unquote, there first and using it first, which obviously to anyone who's indigenous would be like, oh, well, then why isn't it Native American?
Right.
Yeah, it's because it's, through this political system that was set up for them, and they get these beneficial senior water use rights based on a system that, not only left us out, but kept us out intentionally. And that has continued to be issued to this day. And even, say it wasn't people who didn't like Native Americans or racist specifically, which there were a lot of, considering especially the first governor of California signed, signed a declaration to create a government-led militia to kill California Indians. That it was at a time where people thought this water was unlimited, that there was no upper limit, that this was never going to, the issues that we're facing now with limited water supply was not a consideration 20 plus years ago, because they could not see how much we would end up using. And those laws don't benefit us the same way today that they did historically. And when I say benefit us, I mean not us as Native people, but California. But but yeah, I think there is change when it comes to those agreements. And I always want to always acknowledge humanity and like farms as well, because I know it's a lot of people who are also trying to like feed their families. They want to do a hard day's work, and they want to do something that they do feel like is contributing to like the larger world. And I mean, feeding people is a huge part of that, but also, who have also been taken advantage of by the state and by larger companies who have forced them into situations that are also not ideal. And that's not everyone, but there are quite a few cattle farmers I've talked to who, have similar underlying values. But I think a lot of that can be changed through policy. And that's why, right, am I not only focused on engineering? I love engineering to death, but I can create all the water solutions in the world with engineering, but if I don't have the policy to back up those solutions and make them actually implemented, then it doesn't matter if I have the engineering solutions. I need the policy to push those into place. And there's a lot of policy opportunities to try to change some of these practices that are currently draining our water supply, and ways that we can buy up some of these water rights and put them towards more environmental flows and beneficial uses, even though it would be difficult and maybe not fair in like the larger context of history, but is still a option going forward.
I agree that there are current landowners that do have ethical practices. You know, there's some watersheds where they create a coalition of the landowners and they get together and, you know, they'll have a sustainable water practice where they will only draw the amount of water that's recharged every year into the aquifer. So, you know, stuff like that is great. Or like cattle farmers who are doing migrational grazing, or they have a vast amount of land, you know, thousands and thousands of acres that they may not necessarily be totally utilizing. And then so then they'll, you know, allow government easements to come onto the property and engage in restoration. So there's definitely a lot of people doing great things out there. I don't want to say that it's everyone, but it is a majority of people who are not holding the land as in the greater good as their first priority. Their first priority is usually what is the most economically feasible practice for me to implement to increase profit. So for you, what would be the water policy that you advocate for?
Oh man, I mean, like there's, I feel like it can't be just one way. This is the non-fun. There's a lot of answers type of answer where I wish I could be like, this one policy will make everything better and we'll never have to worry again. But for me, it takes a lot of policy in spaces that aren't just water, right? For example, like with the cows, it would require not just a change in water policy, but maybe change on subsidies around meat and how our food circulation system works, and even just like our dependency on beef, because a lot of that was through government subsidies as well, and creating this market that maybe is controlled by even larger players who, you know, have restaurants or have other industries that they're trying to see profit, that they benefit from having certain beef and cow legislation go through. But one of the things I know the Water Resource Control Board is pushing right now is beneficial uses for tribes. So beneficial water rights that are specifically tribal beneficial use, and also advocating for environmental flow. So environmental flow being like flow that's literally in the water, like in a river, like that's environmental flow. Water that's not being taken to being used in agriculture or like drinking, or things that were like being taken out of the stream. And there's not a lot of policy that allows for any environmental flow that's like given. And also just the fact that I feel like we do have policies in place that advocate for, you know, minimum flows we need, for example, for salmon, that aren't being respected or aren't being given even when we do have the policy in place. So not only the policy, but the regulation and the monitoring that's required to enforce that policy, and actual repercussions for not following that policy, right? Because that's the other part. You can have also like farms that are, you know, okay with like, or are down with helping the environment, but if the ones who aren't being punished or aren't being monitored, then we're all still losing as well. Because it's one thing to put policy in place, and it's another thing to have enforcement for that policy.
You bring up a really interesting point. And actually we get into this in my interview with Chris as well, and also just from my experience of talking with different landowners being involved in restoration. You know, you get people who they'll siphon off a river or a creek upstream, and you know, landowners who have the senior water rights, they'll notice that because they'll notice that water isn't coming down where it used to. And then what we talk about in my interview with Chris is he talks about how much water was being stolen by illegal marijuana grow operations. He said there was 1 billion gallons of water that was taken from illegal grow operations. And he actually used drone footage to map out where a lot of these illegal grow operations were and where they were siphoning off river. and he turned it into the police force, and nothing was done about it. And there's a huge issue. There's cartels that'll come up and they'll set up operations. You know, they'll take over a well on a property that someone owns and basically say, "We'll pay you pretty good to keep your mouth shut, but you know, pretty much you're gonna die if you try to fight back. So you might as well just take this paycheck anyway." You know, so there's a lot of that going on as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's right. There's not just one water issue, it's a million, which makes it difficult. But I mean, that's the great thing about working with teams, right? It's like not one of us has to come up with a solution. We can work together to find this multitude of solutions that will be needed to fight this multitude of problems. But I when I was working, I forget for who, I think the Yurok Tribe and the National Forest Service doing trail crew, I was making GPS markers of, I think, for a telephone line to come in like the middle of nowhere on the res in the mountains. And I remember how, because I was a teenager, it was so scary because you'd walk around and there's these like huge marijuana grows, like fields everywhere in the mountains that are illegal, especially then. And you'd hit tripwires because I'm like trying to walk to like make these GPS locations, and you'd have tripwires set, you'd have dogs come out, and like there's this like guy with like these long white dreads with the shotgun on his back, like video recording.
Oh my god.
And I'm 17 years old, just trying to take markers down to get $17 an hour. Like I'm not trying to report you to anywhere. But like that was scary, and I can't. Yeah, I just want to sympathize that. Like, yeah, that is a real issue, and not only like taking the water, but also pollution through like the pesticides they're using for their plants, and leaving garbage in these locations or blocking off streams. And then when they leave, they don't undam them, just like these small dams, but still leaving this huge impact. It's horrible. And yeah, that's definitely an issue that continues to be a problem. I think the legalization in California has changed it a bit. And I also know there was a Yurok task force that also helped with other services that found several illegal grows and helped dismantle them. But it's such a widespread issue that I think a lot of people don't recognize how much harm that's caused. And it's just one of those things. There's so much that we already know with water and how we're not getting enough, and that there's not enough for all the water that's promised, but also all that's taken that's illegally being taken that we don't have that accounting for.
You know, I heard a story that back in the day, the Hells Angels had come up here and took over an entire mountainside up near Witchpet. And they had set up a bunch of illegal grows, and they were up there for a few years. And it turned into a huge issue until they were finally pushed out.
And you have to watch that Netflix documentary on Murder Mountain. That's all about like the illegal pot grows in the Humboldt Mountains.
Oh, you're talking about Bigfoot?
No, no, Murder Mountain. It's a documentary on the murders that's happened in the Humboldt area here from pot growers.
I watched one called Bigfoot. It's on Hulu, and I had watched it because I thought it was going to be about Bigfoot, and it just really ended up turning out to be about some guy named Bigfoot. That yeah, I guess they bring over illegal immigrants to do all their harvesting and work, and then at the end of the season, they basically kill all the workers.
Oh, I haven't heard of that. That sounds awful too. I don't. It's all bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's scary.
So water policy took a dark turn, and that's what happens when you really start looking into water policy.
Yeah, I mean, water is life. I mean, it's like something. It's unreplaceable, and it is a lot of money. And I mean, again, talking about legislation too, there's some work that's being done to counteract this, but when it comes to beneficial use rights, if you don't use it, you lose it, is kind of like the terminology with that. So there's an incentive to use water that you wouldn't necessarily like it's not conducive to like a conservation or like a minimal mindset when it comes to using water, because you have to use all your beneficial uses. Otherwise, it will get transferred to the next senior rights holder. And so there's an incentive to use all your water each year. And then in addition to that, there's block scheduling for water usage as well, which basically means kind of like electricity bills, I think is how it works, where like the more you use, like it goes into a different tier system for cost. So for a lot of water use, the more water you use, the less it costs. And that's also not great for conservation, is because it makes it easier to use more water because it costs less per unit the more you use. And so I think there's simple things like that that we can consider changing that would be at least a step in the right direction.
It creates an incentive in the opposite direction to use more water. If anything, it should be more expensive the more water you use. But
Yeah.
what is your definition of beneficial use? Because that could really mean anything.
Well, I mean, I don't have my definition. I go by the state's definition of beneficial use rights. So beneficial use is a legal term for senior water rights holders that, and I don't have it memorized off the top of my head, but it just lays out different ways water can be used and documented to keep your water rights going forward.
But I mainly mean like beneficial to whom? So is it like the greater?
No, beneficial use is mainly like you're taking the water out of the system and putting it somewhere else.
Right, because like for example, for me, like lily bulb farms to me is not a beneficial use of water. Like I don't even know where you buy lily bulbs, to be honest with you. But most of it's going to China. All right, so don't let the Republicans know. But there's Chinese lily bulb farms in Northern California. Tell Trump. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not really kidding, but I'm kind of.
I mean, that was one of my, one of the protests I contributed to very smallly, but was the liquefied natural gas pipeline in Oregon, where we were trying to kind of hyphenate as LNG, trying to stop this pipeline from happening. And this pipeline project kept coming up for, I think 15 years. It kept dying and then coming up again. And hopefully we finally killed it for good. But this gas line was crossing over 400 waterways in Oregon, which included waterways that then were coming to us because they're upriver to us in Northern California in the tribe. And the liquefied natural gas was coming from Canada or, the northern states and being shipped to Asia mainly. And so it's just like we take on all the risk of all our waterways being crossed by this pipeline, and yet we're not really getting any of that financial benefit even from this transaction. And so that's where environmental justice comes in, right? That's like an unfair distribution of benefit and cost. And so for beneficial uses, I'm like looking at this definition for California. It's 37 pages.
Oh, okay, a lot of room for legal loopholes in there. Then.
Well, I mean, I think that's why it is 37 pages, is because there's trying not to be very much room for they're like, if a definition is that long, it's because they're trying to really make it clad tight, because right, again, water is so beneficial and there's so many legal fights over water, and beneficial uses is a legal definition that's so essential to water rights in California that it has to be really well defined. But like on the ethical level, how I see beneficial use does not match this terminology. And of course, do I think that Native Americans were all of a sudden decided that none of us are going to use water ever and that we shouldn't have any say in it? Of course not. Like we should, if anything, going with the law and how it should ethically be applied, like tribes should have the senior water rights for beneficial use. But that's not the way that the current system is held. And I would love to see it changed, but it would require a lot of legal battle to change these definitions around who holds water rights. And that's why I think one of the options, like you were saying, everything comes down to like monetary gain, is to buy these water rights from the current users and find incentive programs to do so rather than trying to do all these legal battles. And it will probably take a combination of both, but the system's not made for people like us to succeed in necessarily.
Right. Because our incentives are completely different. It's not profit driven. And that's something that the Western systems and structures just cannot comprehend, is that portion of it. But like there's always that in the back of their mind, like what are they really trying to gain? Like what are they really trying to do? Speaking about them and their perspective of us, and them not understanding that we're not profit driven. They're still like really trying to figure out, like, no, what are they really trying to get out of it? Because they can't see past their own selfish, like, this is what I receive, and that's not how we approach. But that which leads into, it segues into a good conversation, because you're studying indigenous knowledge systems. You're going to be going to the UN soon. You've been to the UN before. You're heavily involved in on a government and political level. So, what is your idea of sovereignty, and what is your idea and perspective behind Indians getting involved in the political atmosphere in Western structures?
I mean, what a simple question. I mean, sovereignty for me is, I mean, a lot of things, but I guess at a very basic level, the ability for tribes to have the ability to make decisions on our own behalf and to execute those in a equitable way. But that, I mean, it's hard to even say that, because where we're at currently is because of injustices that have historically been placed upon us, even with decisions made in good faith on our part. And I would ideally like to see tribes being recognized in United Nations spaces as like separate entities, as having a say, having voting power. In like an ideal world, I would love to see Indigenous entities being able to be recognized as like nations on a global level, and being able to have a say in these decisions, and not just, being consulted, not even being given a consultation, but like, if the government's being nice enough to us, being consulted about our thoughts, and then maybe they'll bring it up or maybe not in these international negotiations around climate. And it feels unfair because, right, we as Indigenous peoples worldwide, not saying I speak for any, Indigenous peoples as a whole, but in my opinion, we are facing repercussions of climate change at a higher rate than other groups are. And our connection to the environment makes us extra susceptible to these changes and our understanding of relationship with the world. And yet we're doing so much work with protecting of biodiversity, protecting of water, and protecting of forests. Like we're disproportionately being harmed and disproportionately doing a lot of the protection, and yet being kept out of the conversation. And so that feels inherently unfair to me. And so it's kind of hard where, again, like this conversation of how I think things ought to be, how I think things should be, versus trying to take incremental steps to trying to get at least closer, versus like kind of just giving up on the issue. For me, that's being at places like this United Nations COP meeting, because which is the climate change gathering of nations or parties in the United Nations to discuss climate change policy. Because at least me being there, or other Indigenous peoples being there, is at least disrupting that narrative just a little bit. And I can get my ideas out there even if I'm not at the negotiating table. I can just hope some people who do get to make the negotiations get to hear some of what I say. And for me, one of the number one things is making connections with other Indigenous leaders who are also fighting for their rights on the local level, who are also wanting to find solutions. And maybe we have solutions that they haven't heard of before. Maybe they've found ways to succeed that would be beneficial to our tribes, but we just haven't had that connection before, especially because, technology has developed in my lifetime, or our lifetime, to even have these international connections so casually. And so I think there's a lot of ability there to help each other out as Indigenous nations, where I would like to be recognized as UN, by the UN, as tribes, but I think there's also a lot of work we can do on tribal nation to tribal nation, where we can support each other. And that's kind of where I'm trying to be, is disruptive a little bit, sharing ideas where I can, and making new connections where we can support each other on an international level to hopefully have not the ultimate destruction of everything, but you think it's frustrating because also in the UN, you talked about money previously. There's a lot of companies that stand to make a lot of money on climate change, and climate change is very beneficial for them and selling the solutions to it. And that is one of the more depressing parts I learned the last time I was at the UN. So as much as I can disrupt that, the better, even if it's just a grain of sand in the larger beach that is this movement.
But yeah, I appreciate you, Brooke, for having this conversation with me. We've really covered a lot, and we really only dove not so deep into each topic because I know you just have a wealth of knowledge and experience that you bring to the table. We really could have gone a lot deeper in the different things that we covered. But for the sake of time, I think we should just end it here. And I'd love to hear more about your work. And everyone who's interested in wanting to know what you have going on, could you please tell them where they could listen and follow in?
Yeah, if you would like to keep updated with me, you can find me on TikTok, Instagram, or I'm trying to be on Blue Sky more, but my tag is at Brook M. Thompson. So BROOK_M_THOMPSON on Instagram. Same thing without the underscores on TikTok, or at brookmthompson.com, where you can see my posts there. And yeah, feel free to find me on social media. I'm happy to answer questions people have individually. And just keeping in mind that I am still learning, my ideas and understanding are subject to change as the world continues to change around me too. So I'm excited to learn more and hopefully, find some solutions to these issues. And if not find the solutions, at least figure out where we're going wrong and make progress in a forward way. So think there's a lot of excitement for the future. And despite every scary thing that's happening right now, people like Dylan really show me how much excitement there is for people to want to do this hard work, and that there are solutions out there and there are people willing to put everything they have, not only in the job, but in just themselves and in their free time to try to make this progress. And I am just so excited to be interviewed by you. Thank you so much for having me here.
You're welcome. And you hear that, everyone? You're going to find something, get passionate, get active, get out there, get like Brooke, and get something done.